Thank you so much for being here. I know this is a sacrifice to be here during Memorial Day weekend. I owe some of you a barbecue. Um, I'm going to introduce the panelists quickly and hand it over to Joy, who will be moderating this session. Um, Amal Ahmed is an environmental journalist. She's and also a friend of mine. She's formerly written for the Texas Observer and Floodlight News, and she's written about topics such as managed retreat and climate migration. I think a lot of times we hear about like climate refugees and climate migration, and sometimes we fail to consider how it's happening right here in our own backyard. So she had an excellent piece that actually I had cited in class reports. We also have Layalee Ramahi. She has years of experience in sustainable finance and also a good friend of mine. She's currently the North American Regional Coordinator for the United Nations Environment Programs Finance Initiative, and will speak to us more about finance. We have Andrew. Andrew, I cannot pronounce your last name. Andrew Kay, who is a climate scientist, also one of my former professors and a lecturer at Columbia University. He's worked with the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center and several other international organizations on climate forecasting, designing their early warning systems, and climate policy. And we also have Catherine Callaway, whose architecture firm is a sponsor of this conference. We're very honored to have her here today. She's an architect for Kirksey Architecture, whose work focuses on sustainable architecture and design. I think what's also very interesting, she was president of the American Institute of Architects Houston chapter in 2017 during Hurricane Harvey. So she was fielding like a lot of media requests and kind of requests from architects too about how we can build more sustainably when we see like increasing the intense kind of like disasters. All right, I'm gonna mute myself and turn my video off and hand this off to Joy.
So much. And again, thank you, panelists, for being here. Our panel today is on climate adaptation. So essentially, that is how we adjust current and anticipated impacts of climate change, and with the goal of essentially fortifying and building resilience in these communities. And so, with that in mind, what are some climate impacts or consequences of climate change that you and this is open for any of our panelists, have seen in your work, whether in DFW or globally?
I'll jump in. Yeah, certainly in the built environment, we have seen how, prairies around Texas are taken over to create new developments, straining water resources and reducing ecosystem benefits that we can see. I love the cat entering the conversation. But those impacts of as an architect, like realizing what our work can have an impact on the planet is part of what we are here to talk about today.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Can you speak to how people, perhaps even governments, we were speaking a little bit of that, of kind of how politics can sometimes play a role. But in what ways are those same entities maybe adapting to these impacts?
Oh, are they adapting? Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I mentioned development. Certainly, we are at the government level are always revising and shifting, like reviewing what our development policies are. Sometimes in a helpful direction, sometimes not in a helpful direction as far as climate impacts go. So that's where the government, plays such a huge role with when people want to get a permit to do a new building or development. That's a hurdle they need to go through to make sure they comply with the local regulations. And so if those regulations can be helpful in providing for, addressing and mitigating the potential impacts, that's where they need to be.
Absolutely. And sometimes we know with energy permitting reform, those to even get those projects or permits approved, it takes several years. And that kind of, while, keeping harm in local communities that might be harmed by certain projects in mind, keeping, efficiency and time as far as climate change projects in mind as well. So yes, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm I'd be happy to add something there. I think something that's been top of mind for me in the Dallas area, kind of thinking about the way that folks are engaging on climate and climate policy, is thinking about the really strong push for environmental activists to recognize the role of the military-industrial complex in climate change, right? So we've seen there's a ton of weapons manufacturers based in Dallas, for example, Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics and some of these other companies, where there's actually been a lot of activism around that, with the war in Gaza and the amount of bombs that have been dropped and buildings that have been destroyed and have to be rebuilt in Palestine, and just the enormous climate impacts of that, right? And I think that connecting these two things kind of really speaks to this idea that we have, think globally and act locally, right? So we're seeing a lot of people doing that kind of environmental justice organizing in their community around these global issues. And something that I've also written about, is the movement for boycotting Chevron gas stations for their role in the Israeli occupation of Palestine, right? And a lot of that is coming from folks in Houston who are saying, this is happening in our backyards, right? Like all of the emissions and the drilling and all of that, like it starts here and it gets exported everywhere else. Yeah, so I think that's been like a really interesting kind of connection that we're seeing too, and just thinking about how what happens in the United States in our own backyards, impacts folks all around the world.
Thank you, Amal, especially climate justice piece that, what happens in the United States or DFW, however you want to think about it, is not within a microcosm. And it really does call climate as an issue, does call on us to recognize the other intersectional issues that cause climate change. And like you said, the military industrial complex is definitely a big one. And not seeing those connections, I think, is a big gap and a big obstacle to solving climate change, because if we don't make those connections, then we're missing big contributors to our issues. So thank you.
I guess, sorry, just quickly, maybe we can explain what climate adaptation is first. We've discussed impacts, right? How climate change is making weather disasters more severe, and also like how rainfall patterns have become more variable, and Melina discussed how it impacted farmers and et cetera, et cetera. But can one of the speakers just give a quick definition of climate adaptation?
Not to jump in here, but I would take the mic and put Andrew on the spot here to give us just a bit of an overview of mitigation/adaptation. But probably, Andrew, I can put you on the spot on this one.
Yeah, we could talk about it a little bit. I think I could do my best. Hold on, is my connection just cut out? Okay, I think it's back now. Yeah, so we talk a lot about, related to climate, I mean, it's common to hear the terms like mitigation and adaptation, and specifically in terms of climate solutions. Is this a adaptation solution or driven solution, or is it a mitigation solution or a related solution? And essentially, in a very oversimplified way to describe the difference, mitigation is referring to CO2. How do we decrease the concentration of CO2? And there's many ways to do that. Are we doing everything we can? Definitely not. But in terms of the technology is available to decrease the level of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Yes, there's new technology and improvements in existing technology year after year. That said, even if we're able to, and we have the financing at the appropriate levels for, and the political will to support CO2 decrease, it'll take time, for the effects of, let's say, extreme weather and the other types of impacts from climate on social, culture, political elements, just essentially how we experience climate and climate extremes. It's going to take time for those to, let's say, return to normal. So that return to normal period, even if, again, we're sufficiently keeping the CO2 concentrations to a somewhat lower level, or they're actually decreasing, we're going to need to think about addressing the risks that we're facing now and in the years ahead. So we need to think about mitigation. Again, we need to take action, but we also need to make sure that, the people feeling the greatest impact from extreme weather events and extreme climate events are usually the most underserved, or the most vulnerable, or the traditionally deprioritized populations. And therefore, we need adaptation strategies to address the current risks and the likely risks that will persist in the coming years. Not for all people, indeed, that is the case, but we must focus on a very important metric, which is the disproportionate impact from extreme climate and weather events. And that is really at the core of, let's say, appropriate or sufficient adaptation strategies. This idea of like, oh, well, we're going to decrease flood risk for everybody. I mean, that'll help to some extent, but that doesn't do much in terms of decreasing the disproportionate impacts felt by different people, let's say across Texas or across Houston, as we saw in Hurricane Harvey, for example. So that wasn't the best overview, but I think the important thing is mitigation and adaptation. We need to think about them in the same, maybe not in the same sentence necessarily, but it's the same part of the same story. Decreasing CO2, that's one of the core elements of mitigation strategies to address climate and climate risk. And adaptation are some of the other infrastructural, political, also socio-cultural approaches to understanding risk, decreasing risk, and making sure that the populations who are impacted the most are prioritized, are central and prioritized in those plans. So that's a bit of my take on this, but please, I think others can definitely add to that.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. Anyone else would like to add on to that? I think that was a great overview, helping to kind of make those distinctions.
Yeah, I just think at the basic level, the adaptation is implying we're seeing things change around us. So how are we changing our behaviors or our processes or our systems to adjust to a new normal, and whatever normal is? And so always looking for new creative ways to address what's happening around us.
Thank you, Catherine. And just to keep us moving, and I think that's a good transition of, can we discuss a bit about climate forecasting and the role that plays, or how can it be used as a strategy for climate adaptation?
Yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit about, this kind of touches on a lot of the reporting that I've done on disaster recovery. So I think what I've typically seen a lot is like climate forecasts can be really crucial in like saving lives, right? Like when a hurricane's coming and you have time to prepare, you have time to evacuate, you have time to make all those plans, like that is the number one thing that can like save people's lives, right? And when you don't have that is when we see kind of things that are like natural disasters, right, become tragedies, right? And you see people not being able to get out or not even knowing that they shouldn't be in a specific place. So I think in terms of like, at least for me and my reporting, like the adaptation angle for me is thinking about how do we actually improve things like warning systems and preparation and like the education and advocacy around, here are the things you need, here's where you can go, right? Like that kind of stuff, right? And I think a really good example of this is like recently in Kentucky, there were tornadoes where that warning system failed, right? And we kind of saw that become more deadly than it might have needed to be, right? So I think that's a really important thing to pay attention to, especially because these systems are, currently being defunded and a lot of folks are losing their jobs in this field. So to me as a reporter, like thinking about the kind of impacts to communities on the ground, like that's been something really top of mind.
Thank you. Especially being cognizant of how those agencies or different organizations that are supposed to alert us or do that climate forecasting, how they are kind of being impacted now with the current administration. It is important, like we said, for not only our local communities, but just as a whole, to be cognizant of that and think of maybe innovative ways to overcome that if, but yes. Yeah, I think that's good for forecasting. Texans still remember Hurricane Harvey, which for a lot of those in Houston displaced them and destroyed a lot of people's homes. Several studies attributed the severity of what happened to climate change. To any of you who want to answer, what has Houston done since then to better, prepare adaptations for such extreme weather like hurricanes?
Is that one for me to answer or someone else? I don't know, but I can speak to some of that or someone else can jump in. So immediately after Harvey, we worked with our local government entities and engineers and architects and others in the built environment sphere to revise our development guidelines, specifically around stormwater detention, which means how much rainwater can you hold on your site in a pond or in a ditch or in some pipes or something underground? How can you hold it on the site longer so that it's not quickly released to the neighbors or to the stormwater infrastructure, which is already full from the rest of the storm? And so after that storm, they updated the guidelines to require holding stormwater longer. However, a couple weeks ago, they have started to dial back some of those, some of it in a helpful way, some of it we'll see how it turns out. But like I mentioned earlier, that conversation is always evolving. There is often amnesia a few years after a major event like that, where people kind of settle into a new rhythm and want to and forget about the major impacts that can have. So stormwater detention is one way that Houston has started to adapt as far as how development can go. We also revised how high you need to build a new building above the surrounding area based on the potential flooding that may occur. And so they raised it. So you have to build a little bit higher, the finished floor. And that is primarily to keep people safe, because we want to keep them out of harm's way.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing. We know architecture plays a big role in, not only the mitigation, but adaptation that we just spoke to. Aside from stormwater detention, are there other ways buildings could be designed to handle or withstand some of this extreme weather better? Not just flooding, but excessive heat and sometimes when we have those freak ice storms.
Right. Right. So, number one, we always want to look at passive strategies of how the building can, provide for the needs of the people while also thinking about things like energy efficiency and water efficiency. And so two of our best sources of looking for that inspiration is our ancestors. How did they build in this area before air conditioning and lighting? How did they, create a building with shade or overhang to promote that breeze going through? And that's a passive strategy. Like an overhang is just sitting there shading your windows so you can still have some daylight and look out, but it's not getting that direct heat. The second source is nature. So how can we learn from nature? There's a term called biomimicry, where we can look to specific things things in nature are doing, whether it's a plant or animal or anything system, and learn from that to apply to our projects. So definitely looking at the passive strategies first, and then applying, low energy using appliances and equipment, looking at what's the right air conditioning system, those kinds of things. Those are the active strategies that use energy. And we've talked a lot today already about water and renewable energy sources. So that's where all of those things start to layer on and have add into a positive impact.
Absolutely. So innovation, some of that, but really leaning back on strategies maybe from indigenous communities that, would be relevant to the local area that they've been doing for thousands of years. So absolutely. I love those. I love that phrasing, passive type of intervention. So
yeah, and if I could just add real quickly, I think that's really interesting. Also thinking about there are neighborhoods in Houston and Harris County where the recovery from these storms is still ongoing. Andrew kind of touched on this inequity, right? There are neighborhoods where adequate flood infrastructure still, hasn't arrived in these places. So I think we also kind of have to think about raising that baseline, right? So that folks who, do survive a hurricane, like they are actually building back better. They're not just struggling to kind of build this home back to this standard that's like outdated and doesn't meet like current code requirements, right? Because that's what happens a lot of times after hurricanes. There's a lot of groups in Houston that focus on these issues, like West Street Recovery, Bayou City Waterkeeper, thinking about infrastructure. I believe they have a campaign called Justice in the Sewers that's kind of about this issue of water backing up into people's houses in rainfall, for example, in specific neighborhoods, lower income communities of color. So yeah, I think it's also really important to think about, like, we need to build back better to these higher standards, energy efficiency, but there's a lot of folks who that baseline has never really been met.
And we've kind of touched on it a bit, as climate gets worse, it's again a risk multiplier. So for individuals who are already facing environmental risk and hazards, that it's only going to get worse when you add extreme weather into the equation. So yes, thank you for, I love anchoring climate conversations to equity. So thank you for that.
So maybe I can come in here, building on the plot, since I have to talk about the least exciting part, which is how do we finance all of that, and how do we make sure that we put in the basic building blocks to build resilience for communities, and especially centering equity on it. So building on what was mentioned, between looking at climate as a challenge, between mitigation and adaptation, our need to mitigate climate risks have been the center of our policy, of our actions, of what projects and where we spend the money in terms of lowering greenhouse gas emissions, and financing those issues in the simplest form of saying renewable energy to change our energy resources is very clear. The mitigation aspects, what to finance, are easier for everyone. But I would like to simplify it by thinking of maybe putting finance in a broader context, which is basically, finance is a tool. It is a way for us to make decisions with our money. So the money would go based on where our priorities are and what we identify as important. So considering where we spend this little amount of money that we have on different priorities that we require. So in challenging this narrative, I always would agree to Amal that we need to build back forward, but that's always putting adaptation or spending the money after the disaster hits and allocating that money to recover. And if we make the mistake of not allocating that money to rebuild to the most vulnerable communities, that would make chronic communities extra vulnerable to extreme changes in the weather and the hazards that are being faced by those communities. So when we put adaptation into context, we need to think about the planning. We need to think about investing in those resilience measures before the disaster actually hits. But when it comes to adaptation finance, the problem with it, with a difference from mitigation, is that it really needs to come with policy. And where do these funds come? So when we look at it, the funds for adaptation are way less than the funds for mitigation. There is, even in the US more broadly, no concrete estimate on how much adaptation requirements we would need. So we would, so Catherine was mentioning that we need to work on our sewage system. There is no private household that'd be like, I will update that for the entire neighborhood. That's not something that is easy to do. It's not like a household saying, I will use renewable energy for my energy resources. It is more of a broader community-based level. So what are the federal funds that are allocated to influence or encourage communities to adapt? And then you come at the state level. What is the state putting policy in place to direct those funds to save communities, to build those resilience? And then you come to philanthropy, to NGOs in these communities, to private business in terms of what are they doing to be more resilient in face of increased efforts. And then we finally come to the household. What are their input and their role, and what hazard mitigation they are taking into place in form of adaptation. So it could be as simple as taking retrofits in their own home, whether applying or investing in a pump. What are the tax breaks or funding resources that are allocated to these households? And also, what are other financial mitigants that they have, which usually we hear about insurance policies. What insurance policies do you have as a form of adaptation or financial resilience methods? But when it comes to adaptation, it is different than mitigation, because mitigation, I always say there's an easy access to put the entire problem on a consumer basis to dilute the huge impact and the huge needs that we need to do. Like it's you purchasing that plastic straw that destroyed the climate. No, it's not. That's miscommunication. And adaptation is the same thing. I can't save my house only from a fire if the entire neighborhood is burning down. And adaptation puts that in context, and also the finance that comes with it. I know finance is not the loveliest of topics, but we cannot change what we cannot finance.
Layalee, can you speak quickly about adaptation finance globally, right? Like there's a lot of money in the US. I mean, maybe less so from the federal level right now. But what about countries that are struggling with high levels of national debt and don't want to take out another 20% loan from the World Bank or somewhere else to finance levies for or like some sort of seawall or like large scale infrastructure projects? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Oops, struggling with the mute button there. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the global landscape applies on adaptation finance similarly to mitigation. So even in the US, the global landscape is similar. I'm sure you covered it in terms of the basis of international climate, let's just say treaties and negotiations, pinned under the Paris Agreement, which you covered, I'm sure, before. It's built on the polluter pays principle, right? So it builds on developing countries, or countries in particular that were more responsible for climate change, for their emissions, have to compensate the countries that have done the least, and especially communities that have done the least in impacting climate change. And they would support that in finance on climate mitigation and adaptation for them to diversify their energy resources, cut their emissions footprint, and develop in a sustainable manner. But also, how do they finance their adaptation requirements? And unfortunately, as it is very clear, we're not meeting our climate commitments in terms of mitigation or lowering emissions. And as Andrew mentioned, that doesn't negate the need to build resilience. Those financing flows towards adaptation from developed to developing countries are not up to the required level of funding. So up to the most recent statistics, we've seen a slight increase in global flows of adaptation finance to developing countries. And here we're talking about the most vulnerable, in particular being island nations, because they are extremely vulnerable to climate hazards. It has reached in total around 28 billion. Okay, you'd think that 28 billion is a major number, but it's not, because the gap is around 250 to 400 billion in terms of meeting those adaptation requirements. So those adaptation requirements, there needs to be concessional. By concessional means grant funding with low interest rates, or funding from those governments. That can be the basis for these developing countries and countries that are at facing the most vulnerability to fund their resilience projects, as you said, whether it's building resilient infrastructure, building seawalls, and by default, not everything is a seawall, okay? It doesn't have to be a big funding project. Sometimes it can mean as simple as having the funding to relocate communities that are continuously going to be facing hazards. So not just in terms of response directly after a disaster, but to invest to avoid these disasters. So unfortunately, from a global landscape, it mirrors the US. Adaptation is not still funded properly. We do have a huge funding gap. And as climate negotiations improve and we make new commitments, we are still absolutely behind. And the current global landscape, as you mentioned, is extra sensitive, where developing countries are suffering from huge debt crises, which that means they are required to continue to borrow and at very exuberant interest rates. And without investing in mitigation adaptation, even their funds are just sort of responding to continuous crises. So that means you're always behind. So compare it if you are constantly borrowing money to pay out the people you borrowed. So you're constantly in that loop cycle. And that's what's happening. So compare it to your personal funding. This is exactly what's happening at a government level. And it's not making anyone more resilient or more able to withstand the extremes that are happening from climate change.
I'm just going to ask one more follow-up question, and I'm going to get out of your hair, Joy. But just to follow up on the question about climate forecasting, and I know Andrew has a lot of experience in this field. So, for example, predicting weather patterns like a few months out, so that farmers know what kind of crops to buy, or if they should switch crops or what to plant and where, particularly in developing countries, and also like what kind of if it's like a particularly wet season, maybe they don't need as much irrigation, versus if it's a drier one, they might need to invest in more like drip irrigation technology, etc. But Andrew, could you speak a little bit about that, like what role climate forecasting can play in adaptation, both globally and in Texas and the US?
Yes. Yeah, so there's been, I guess I'll start by saying my background is in meteorology, so in weather forecasting mostly. And back when I was a young weather nerd, I guess, climate was secondary on most meteorologists, let's say, mind. Especially in the US in the 80s and 90s, there was a big push in the media, but also just in the scientific community of like extreme weather is exciting. It's happening more and more. We weren't calling it climate change. We weren't even talking about the connection to climate, but it actually did a lot for people to be drawn to the science of meteorology, me included. And over time, I felt the responsibility to work more at the climate and meteorology interface, let's say. And I'm saying this because forecasting extreme weather events for like tomorrow or next week, I know this time of year in Texas, there's a lot of severe weather, severe convective storms, and perhaps risk of tornadoes. That's very different than talking about the change in trends over 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. There's different approaches from a quantitative perspective, and there's different ways to validate those forecasts from a statistical perspective. But we try to connect these different timescales because it's important to do so. Whereas we may not be able to say with strong confidence through the science that a particular tornado is due to climate change, right? We can say that there may be trends in some places where we're seeing more tornadoes or stronger tornadoes or earlier tornado outbreaks, or later tornado outbreaks. So we're seeing shift in the season, for example. And these are important statements to make. However, whatever type of statement you make, it is incomplete without some element of uncertainty. And we see that in our weather forecast. 10% chance of rain, 20% chance of severe weather. Like we're very used to this in shorter term timescales. But longer term, it's sometimes perceived to be by some as, well, it just means we're not sure of what's going to happen. Right? We may see a slight shift in temperature by 1 degree in the next 20, 30 years, and we assign a level of confidence to that. And it's actually it's similar approaches from a scientific perspective of how we assess the confidence of these statements. And when we're talking about, I'm trying to tie it into like the Texas context, I've done a lot of work on Hurricane Harvey, especially after the fact, assessing the ways that the forecasts were produced for precipitation and how they were communicated relative to the different types of flood risk that is in essentially captured when we're talking about a tropical cyclone or a hurricane. You know, there's many types of floods that could happen. Was the risk disaggregated and communicated in a way where when we were saying there's likely to be floods, people in Northeast Houston understood those to be flash floods rather than coastal floods kind of in the south of Houston or in Galveston Bay, right? These are very different types of floods with different impacts and also with different levels of disproportionate impacts on the various communities and neighborhoods in the areas where they're likely to see some impact. But I think just to summarize, yes, forecasts are getting better. In my career, I've seen both weather forecasts on the shorter time scale and also longer term climate projections. We're getting better. We have more data. We're able to validate those forecasts more appropriately, but there will always be some levels of uncertainty. Uncertainty is not a bad word. Sometimes it is weaponized against scientists. It is actually an amazing concept that allows us to do many cool and interesting and important scientific calculations. Without uncertainty, we wouldn't be able to say much about these very chaotic physical systems that we're trying to understand. So uncertainty is actually our friend. Don't be afraid of it. It's something we think about a lot. But the last thing I'll say is, my advice to people that are interested in forecasting climate or weather, any sort of physical process, the source really matters. You know, and lately we're seeing a proliferation of apps, for example, or websites that have invested a lot in the marketing of their data and in the visualizations and in the user friendliness. So they seem cool. They seem like prettier maps, you know, we want to trust them. But many times the underlying data is not as good as the government products. And many of the government products are in jeopardy right now. So ask questions about where the data is coming from. Kind of try to look past the pretty maps, you know, and the nice visualizations. Ask about the source, ask about the data. And yeah, it makes things a little bit more complicated. But when we're talking about improving our understanding of risk and taking appropriate action at some time before an event might occur, there definitely could be too much data and too little time to process that. So my suggestion is kind of understand what data you're engaging with every day. And yeah, seek to learn more about it. You know, what's under the hood, where is it coming from? Because a lot of it is coming from the government, and a lot of those government data sources are in jeopardy right now, and that will have the impact from that will propagate down to everyone's daily life, unfortunately.
And you're talking about NOAA. I think they have of their forecast. Well,
it's NOAA, but it's not only NOAA. So NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They have a lot of data, but also NASA collects a lot of data using satellites. A lot of my work is with NASA and using satellites to monitor different types of extreme weather events. The USGS, the U.S. Forest Service, like a lot of these government agencies collect very important climate and environmental data. So yes, it's important, and it's definitely at risk right now.
That's all you.
Thank you, Andrew. I think we are on to our last question. Alma, I'll kind of direct this one to you. I know there are a lot of reports in the news about climate refugees. And so I was hoping if you could discuss managed retreat and how that's has or had been probably implemented in Houston, and just a little bit about how climate migration could impact Texans one day.
Yeah, you said that was directed for me, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I cut out a little bit. Yeah, so I think Zaina kind of referenced at the beginning, I've done a little bit of reporting on a managed retreat program in Houston. And in this case, it's a mandatory buyout program. So essentially the Harris County, which covers Houston, identified a couple of neighborhoods that, they say these are neighborhoods where flooding keeps happening. There's not enough infrastructure, and we could build infrastructure, but these neighborhoods would probably still flood. And instead of having folks, have their homes destroyed, having to do high water rescues, all of this, like every time a storm comes in, like we are going to buy their homes out, demolish the homes, turn them into green space, turn them into flood control programs, right? And so what makes this different from a voluntary program, right, is that it's mandatory. So everybody in this neighborhood has to leave. Like there's no option to stay behind. There's a couple of important reasons for that, right? One is there's a lot more money with a mandatory buyout program because the government declares eminent domain. So there's different funding sources they can use versus a voluntary buyout program, where people can take an offer after a storm if they want or if they don't. People often don't take those because they're not actually getting enough money to relocate. And oftentimes, there's just no kind of compelling reason to leave a neighborhood that you really love. So in this case, folks were moving, like the entire neighborhood was moving. But what became really complicated, right, is that there still wasn't enough funding, right, to kind of give everyone an equitable relocation program, right? And you have, as people were going through the program, you might have had someone going through it early and they were in a really good point in the housing market, and it was really easy or, easier for them to get a nice house, safer flood zone in a neighborhood that they wanted to move to. And then maybe by the time, that person's sister was going through it, interest rates were up, prices are going, skyrocketing. So they may not actually be able to move to the same neighborhood. They may not be able to kind of retreat together, which is the concept of managed retreat, right? And then there were other concerns, around equity. So some of these neighborhoods that were selected were predominantly immigrant communities. A lot of folks owned mobile homes, and these people, they said in public hearings and stuff, like, you guys are not offering us anywhere near enough what we need to move. Like, you're offering me like pennies on the dollar to move, and I own this mobile home outright. Like, where do you think I can go with the money you're giving me, right? Initially, there wasn't enough money for undocumented immigrants or folks who had, mixed status households, because there are federal restrictions on the kind of aid that can go to families with mixed status, right? So the county did have to increase the funding to actually, move some of these families in a fair way. So it's an interesting program just because there's like pros and cons like everywhere you look at it, right? Like there are folks who really did get into better housing, right? Like there are folks who maybe were renters, and because, the community pressure, they actually got enough money to put a down payment on a house, right? They live in neighborhoods where the schools are better, the public services are better, right? But there's still questions about why wasn't this infrastructure built here in the first place, right? So the community that I focused on, Allen Field, borders Greens Bayou. So there was a study from Rice that showed that Greens Bayou was among, when you look at the watersheds of Houston by poverty concentration, Greens Bayou had the highest concentration of households in poverty and the least amount of infrastructure built, right, to protect those homes. So you have this problem where the homes are kind of affordable for the county to relocate because the market says these homes are worth $60,000, right? Versus like folks in River Oaks or some other neighborhood, their homes are worth, 10 times that maybe, right? And if their homes repeatedly flood, like it's a lot more expensive to relocate folks from that neighborhood, right? But they do have flood infrastructure that is lacking in some of these other areas. So there's a whole kind of like ecosystem of questions, I think, that really, comes up around like the kind of historical causes of this repeat flooding in some areas versus others, and the kind of responsibility of the county to, keep people safe, taxpayers, right? Yeah. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that, and another, so for example, like there was like my story focused on these mandatory buyout neighborhoods, which tended to be lower income communities of color, but there's been research, mostly out of Rice, kind of showing the inequities around this. So there was a good book by Rachel Kimbrough about like, I think mothers in River Oaks who were kind of creating their own informal managed retreat programs, right? Like moving together, like, oh, our kids go to the same school and we keep flooding. Like, how do we sort of like use our social capital to move to a safer neighborhood together, right? But those folks kind of had the resources to do that. There's a lot of research about how, disaster recovery money actually deepens inequality. So if you have a home that's worth a lot, you get more money from the government to fix it up, right? Versus when you have a home that's valued less, like it becomes harder. Like a lot of times folks have problems proving that the damage was from the storm and not just kind of, regular lack of maintenance or something, right? So there's a lot of issues with how that happens, right? Yeah, so I think the mandatory retreat program is really interesting because in theory it could serve as a model, because there are so many people that live in the floodplain across the United States. Like there's definitely a need to like figure out how do we keep people safe, and like how do we move people out of places that are now flooding every couple of years. But I think it also just showed the problems in financing that, like Layalee was mentioning. It costs a ton of money that only came out because of Harvey and sort of the allocations from Hurricane Harvey, because of how catastrophic it was, and that still took extra funding from the local tax base to kind of make up for some of those inequities.
Thank you, Amal. I could ask a couple of more questions, but I'm gonna respect our time. Thank you so much for our panelists. If I don't think we had any, but let me check the Q&A just again. We did have one comment about realigning our military industrial complex and repurposing it for a environmental program for tree planting. And I think that would be a much better use of not only those funds, but those resources, people in general. So thank you so much.